Hello, everyone.
A lot of you had some questions, so let's take our seats. So the first thing I want to ask is the IPO. How did that go? How did you raise your money?
For Mastercoin?
Mastercoin.
So the way that worked out is that back in, I believe, well, March or April of last year, JR, J.R. Willett wrote a white paper back in 2012, kind of outlining some of the issues with Bitcoin, which were like kind of security of funds, being able to send funds back, and kind of issue other kind of coins that would provide stability for the Bitcoin network and make it more attractive to the average everyday user adoption. And so when he presented that back, I guess now 2.5 years ago, and then last year at the Bitcoin convention in San Jose, a lot of people came up to him and said, hey, we would like to see you work on this idea. What would it take? And then there was essentially a crowd sale of Mastercoins done in August of last year, which raised, I think, 4,730 Bitcoins.
That's a lot of Bitcoins. How many in dollars?
Well, at that time, it was only worth 600,000, I think.
Only 600.
Yeah, and obviously it's gone up a lot since then. So.
And who controls those Bitcoins now?
So what happened was that was given to a foundation called Mastercoin Foundation, and there's a board that basically approves some of the high-level changes in the spec and what gets implemented, what doesn't get implemented. The idea eventually is that the organization doesn't have to exist and that there will be some kind of proof of stake voting. But to be honest with you, our goal was to not have the organization exist in 1 year. So we're coming up into a year, I think, in September, October. I'm not sure if that's going to happen by then, but we're trying to slowly kind of set up some of these things where it doesn't necessarily have to be run. I mean, ideally what happens with these open source communities is you have adoption by businesses, and then those businesses will fund developers who are maintaining the protocol and the software that's running the protocol. So ideally, that's what stage we want to get to. But I think we're still pretty early on. We've got MadeSafe, we've got these folks coming out. I think it probably would be at least another year before that could be a reality.
And the reason I ask is because accountability is such an important issue. Yeah. So what are these funds being spent on, and is there anywhere people can check to see a ledger?
Yeah, so there's a Google Excel sheet ledger. It's
pretty
not a real sophisticated accounting system. So all the information is on there. We sort of changed the model where in the beginning, there was bounties put out. So there was like a $25,000 bounty for building a block explorer. Then that was followed by a 300 BTC bounty for distributed exchange. And unfortunately, at the time, we thought it was a good idea to do it this way because you get a bunch of different developers. But as it turns out, that caused issues where we had like 3 or 4 different development cycles, and we were trying to sync up, like, okay, this group of developers built something and it doesn't agree with this group of developers, and then that doesn't agree with the third group. And the thing is, like, if you look at Bitcoin and how they've developed, is that there is only one reference Bitcoin client, which is Bitcoin D. So everything else has to, match with Bitcoin D, or it's not in compliance with the spec. And so we kind of went about it in a different way, and we've sort of changed direction in the last, I would say, 3 or 4 months after we realized, like, okay, this is not going to work to have like 4 different groups working simultaneously basically on the same thing.
Right. Now, Nikki, with you, your background is in software engineering, but now you're doing community stuff. How did you raise your money initially when you launched?
Our kind of issuance model was kind of interesting, really. The issuance model for Counterparty was kind of unusual. Our founders decided very early on that having really unusual issuance model for Counterparty. Our founders decided very early on that having huge pools of money was, first of all, not particularly necessary to build a successful project. And secondly, gets in the way of legitimacy in the future, because you end up with an organization, a foundation that has powers of money and lots of influence over the protocol. So there was a news piece written about us called The People Who Burn Bitcoin. The way that our distribution took place was essentially by a process called proof of burn. And what that involves is sending bitcoins to a completely unspendable address. So those bitcoins become unusable. And in return, the system sends back a certain amount of the currency of our network, our native currency, which is called XCP. And all of the XCP has been distributed. It all took place during what we call the burn period, which happened right at the very start of the project in January. And now the XCP is in the hands of all its holders and can be bought on some centralized exchanges like Bitter and also Poloniex, and also on our internal distributed exchange too.
So one of the principal differences then, it sounds like, is that you kept the bitcoins that you raised at the Exodus address, but yours was a proof of burn, which meant all those bitcoins were destroyed.
We like to say sort of gifted to the wider Bitcoin.
And how many bitcoins got burned and how many XCP were generated as a result?
Around about 2,000 bitcoins got burned, which generated 2.6 million XCP. XCP is slightly deflationary. It has two uses in the network. The first is to create assets, as you saw me do on the screen earlier. It costs about £1 to create an asset right now, and it's always going to be extremely cheap. The other use is settling bets, and they are the only two uses for which you need XCP in the network. For everything else, you can just use Bitcoin, and you can trade the assets. It's just Bitcoin transaction fees that matter.
And one of the reasons this is so important is because it gives everyone access to financial services. And I'd like to put a scenario to you both. I tend to drive quite a lot, and I've seen my petrol price go up quite a bit. If I wanted to take a position in oils futures, could I hedge my position, or could my car even be intelligent about it eventually and start trading oils contracts in order to hedge against the rising cost of fuel? Is that the vision?
I'm not sure whether your car could intelligently trade those contracts, but there's no question that those contracts, can and will be made available on Counterparty. And the way that would work would be through people broadcasting price information about the price of oil onto the Bitcoin blockchain, and then you would take a position on that and find another counterparty to partner with you on that trade.
That's great. And you guys have got an exchange as well, but yours is a more broad-based foundation, so actually people can build lots of different apps, not just exchanges on Mastercoin. Is that right?
You mean as far as the distributed exchange or the?
Yeah, so you've got a distributed exchange already, as I understand it, but you can also build other apps on top of Mastercoin. It's not just for exchanges.
Yeah, so the idea is that it's kind of a longer development curve on this part, but the idea is that eventually you can kind of combine some of these coins. Like if you have like something like the block auth coin, which is doing identity verification, that if you are, let's say, a stock issuer and you're in a jurisdiction where you need to restrict the stock ownership to people from the UK. So you would potentially, what you would do is you would take the data from the block auth coin, which, let's say it has notaries in the UK saying, okay, yeah, he's from the UK, he's from the US, he's from Canada, and whatnot. And then you could basically like restrict the trading of those coins to the pool of people that, you're allowed to have trade that particular coin. So I think that is probably like the next sort of generation of like Bitcoin 2.0 is like combining these different coins so that there's like some more advanced logic to them.
Yeah. And how does it work? If I wanted to, for example, to take a position in gold, I would effectively have to put up something called margin, right? So I wouldn't actually be taking possession or inventory of physical gold. I would just be putting the Bitcoin equivalent or your own native coin equivalent.
Yeah, you'd make your wager in XCP, and the whole process works without margin. So you put up the amount of your wager, and the other side would too, and then you each would have a certain amount of leverage. So there would come a point where either party can run out of money to support the wager, but both parties know what they're getting into in advance.
But doesn't a lot of this rely on you guys having liquidity on your own currencies?
Right, and I think that's why it's important to think about like these other, like for those kind of instances, the native coins have to get to a point where there's enough sort of volume, right? But if you have these fiat coins, then you can basically do that, right? And so the key though is that within the protocol, building some kind of a need for the native coin, and so it's kind of used as the conduit for some of the trading, basically. But our idea, well, what we believe, and the market will prove this or disprove this, is that as there are more issuances happening and there's more trading happening of these various kind of distributed application coins and fiat coins and whatever else people come up with, that will naturally create utility for the underlying coin.
Right.
That's the theory.
And I hear there were some teething problems with MadeSafe. Is that right?
Yeah. So I have an economics background. I personally, thought, okay, guys, we kind of think this through. But it was one of those things where there was a timeline when it needed to happen, and the issue was that our protocol at that time had not been. We were only able to do a fundraiser with one kind of coin, and in this case, they wanted two kinds of coins, and so it was, it was basically done in a hacky way, and it kind of blew up a little bit. But at the end of the day, they still got a ton of Bitcoins to support their network. They have a ton of Mastercoins. I've put together also a partnership with a company called Bounty Source, and basically they can now go out there and you can attach a Mastercoin or Bitcoin price to a GitHub issue, and then if someone submits something that you like that fixes that issue, you can pay them in Bitcoins or Mastercoins. So now there is at least one, I think, a pretty decent merchant accepting Mastercoins and Bitcoins for this kind of because the money for this is being it's being created so that Bitcoins or Mastercoins or whatever can come in, so these folks can use it to build up the software and pay developers and whatnot. And there has to be some kind of this is the problem we had with the bounties, is we didn't know how to manage all these people. So there has to be partnerships where there's some intelligence and how do you manage, maybe managing 5 developers is easy, but if you have 20, 30, it starts getting, you have to have some kind of platform for that.
So what we're looking at here is an IPO culture where it's easier to be discovered than ever before. And actually you're going to be running out of excuses not to leave your jobs, because people can just set up their own startup for how much? Less than £1,000 at a kind of startup cost?
Well, I think it depends on the concept and how it's being done, because the thing is with distributed applications, in the case of MadeSafe, they had worked on it for a long time. And even these guys doing Storj, which is a distributed storage network, I think Sean and those folks have been working on it for 5 or 6 months. So they've put quite a bit of work into this. They want to have, a lot of them want to have some kind of proof of concept that people can actually download and try. And, so it doesn't, you don't want to get into this kind of vaporware thing. So I think there has to be some kind of blood and sweat that get put into it. At least I hope.
But the point is that now it's the markets.
Yes.
It's the markets that will
decide.
decide.
The access to the markets is much easier now, especially for a global audience. And you think about I worked in Silicon Valley for 10 years. It's you had to be very special and have a lot of money to get access to Google and Facebook. And now it should be much easier for the average person to discover that and invest.
That's great. Well, it did look like we had a lot of questions, so why don't we start? Adam.
How is what you're doing different to Ethereum and from each other as well? I'm not sure I still quite get it, because you seem to be driving at the same things in a slightly different way.
So the question for the audience was, how is Mastercoin and Counterparty different to Ethereum?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I kind of think of Ethereum as the most general, possible blockchain-based application, in so much that it promises to be, Turing complete. So I think potentially people could build things on Ethereum that mimic the functionality of both of our projects. We are super focused at Counterparty, so we really are just going after a very, very small number of extremely popular use cases. Whereas I think what Ethereum will do for you is they'll provide that extremely long tail of all these extremely small contract use cases, custom use cases. So if you want to use Ethereum, you're going to have to program. You're going to have to write your own contracts and specify them in a programming language. With Counterparty, you can just use these contracts out of the box extremely simply.
And also, I would say that Ethereum is extremely experimental at the moment. We have no idea whether or not their economic model is going to work, whether there will be enough demand for Ether. Do you have anything to add?
I think it's a great idea, and they've done a really great job of getting a lot of people involved, so I think that they will be successful. I think there's a lot of room. Well, if you go back to, there's a book by Hayek talking about private currencies, and he talks about that there would be many private currencies competing for people's interest. And so we can't say that, okay, Mastercoin or Bitcoin or Counterparty or like whatever is going to dominate the whole world, because clearly, I mean, you look at DOG, like they announced that they're going to be inflationary now. So, well, there might be some people that want that, right? I don't know who, but like there might be some people that like that.
But the thing is, that one of the defining features of Bitcoin was it was fixed issuance.
Right, but that appeals to a certain like group of people, right? If you are, I don't know, losing your money all the time, maybe you want inflationary money. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think the Ethereum stuff, it's a different take on a similar problem, and maybe providing a broader base or kind of like operating system level rather than like application level. Maybe compare it that way, like
actually, Charles Hoskinson compares it to the Android of crypto. It's something like the yours. So it'll be like a foundation on which people can
right.
build. Yes, please.
Hi, Anthony Lewis. So you mentioned Fiat coin. So let's take the example of sterling coin. How much should I pay for one? How much should I expect to receive for one? Can I issue £1 billion sterling coin and expect people to give me £1 billion in return for sterling coin? So talk me through how a fiat coin would work and how it would be backed.
So the question is, how would a fiat coin work? How much would they cost? I'm guessing it's the same as what a pound would cost.
Yes. Well, the thing is that these groups are still working on this, so I don't want to reveal their IP, but they have different approaches, which is really weird because I thought that it would all be the same approach. But they're in different geographic regions, and apparently, maybe there's different laws and regulations and this kind of thing. And so they have different approaches, but generally speaking, it appears that it is actually backed by real money sitting in some bank account. And
so that's Ripple, which issues IOU on.
Yeah, essentially, but for Bitcoin. It's Ripple for Bitcoin.
We'll talk about it afterwards.
Yes, at the back.
In your example with Mt. Gox, you said you couldn't pull money out of Mt. Gox, you'd use a fiat coin. Surely you just run out of fiat coins that are being pulled out and you'd end up with the same issue. And a fiat coin would not be worth the exact amount.
Well,
How do you peg it for the right value?
that's not necessarily true, because like with Mt. Gox, there were people who actually were able to get money out of there. But there was... No, I don't know about him, but I personally know people who were able to arbitrage large amounts.
Wow, controversial. But I think what has to work on Mastercoin is someone has to be issuing a feed to the Mastercoin protocol, do they not? They have to be publishing a feed on the price of that currency in order for it to work, no?
No. These are actually, the tokens are backed by actual tokens. So, I mean, it is a little centralized. It's not like perfect, right? But the point is that what you want is that you want to have a bunch of these out there. And so people have a choice. And then maybe what happens is you can look at which one you feel comfortable doing business with. which ones are the ones that are accepted by your exchanges that you work with as a trader. And I think it's more like, I think for the adoption for the average user, it will help because, you know, for me to explain to like my mom, for example, I've tried a few times, but like, you know, for her, like the compelling reason to use Bitcoin right now is like, let's say the getting rid of the credit card fees. Because she didn't have to use credit cards for her business 15 years ago, and now she's got to pay a few percentage points. And then I believe in the EU, there's the directive for lowering the credit card rates in a couple of years. So that will drive margins in that business down, which means that they will probably be forced into using Bitcoin.
Yeah, Nikki, is it right? Does somebody have to not publish the price into Counterparty in order for somebody to be able to make a trade on something like sterling, for example?
Well, let's say, for example, we had, you know, sterling coin inside Counterparty. It would have to be tied to an issuer, so it would be, you know, Nikki sterling coin or Chris sterling coin, so that people would obviously be able to distinguish it between who was backing it. So it would have to be reserve backed, and those reserves would presumably have to be audited with those results being made public. And as the gentleman said, if this did happen, I think it probably will happen. I'd see it kind of behaving in the same way as a Ripple gateway does. And, you know, one sterling coin should cost £1 minus fees. And if it doesn't, that's a big indicator that there's something wrong. You can also potentially do quite interesting things with regard to insurance through Counterparty as well. Some people have kind of mooted the idea of having some kind of like pricing information that says something about how reliable an issuer is. So that potentially you can take a position on whether or not an issuer might fail in the future. So this is a way to hedge the fact that the issuers whose coins you hold might one day go bankrupt.
Very cool. Another question?
Blockchain is a scarce resource. So let's say both Counterparty and Mastercoin work in 3 years' time, and you both have to compete over limit size of block, say 1 megabyte. You both work towards decentralization, so the only way to really increase that block size is by more decentralization. So what do you think about politics of planning?
Yeah, so you guys had an interesting kind of run-in with the Bitcoin core devs. It's a lot of it.
Some of them.
So there was a feature that was advertised called the op return in the latest release of Bitcoin. And what it means is that you're allowed to put in metadata, which your services rely on. And it was slashed from the 80 bytes down to 40 bytes in the latest release. Can you talk a little bit about how sustainable it's going to be in the long run if we're continuing to put lots and lots of data into the blockchain? Because everyone has to download it in order for it to remain decentralized.
Right. Okay, yeah, so it is a scarce resource. It's a scarce resource like my floppy drive was a scarce resource in 1990. I can't assume, at that time I could not assume that that was always going to be the state of the system. Now, of course, with peer-to-peer systems, it is difficult because the scaling just is very, very tough. But I think the devs are aware, they are aware of this issue, and whether or not it's Counterparty, Mastercoin, whatever kind of transactions, the fact is that today, with the number of the transaction throughput, whether like our projects exist or not, just payments, there's just, it has to grow. So they have to figure out ways to make the transaction throughput like, I don't know, 100x minimum to really compete with like Visa network, MasterCard network, bank transfers, all that. So I don't know, we handle our problem. They got their task.
I think to be fair to the Bitcoin core, Jeff Garzik raised this issue that there wasn't enough communication running up to the launches, essentially. And the op return was put in as a way of leaving the window unlocked so that you guys didn't break it. And I think what they're saying is that now you've gone and broken it. People that used Bitcoin before never envisaged it being used as a distributed database. They just imagined it as a currency. So is there not some scope for you using another blockchain like Litecoin, for example?
Absolutely, there is scope. At Counterparty, we consider ourselves to be sort of technology agnostic, I would say. If a better, more suitable alternative comes along, there's no reason why we wouldn't seriously consider moving Counterparty over to a different blockchain. We dearly love for the Bitcoin devs to introduce this 80 byte limit because it would mean that our transactions will be prunable, which means it's more likely for... I suppose the main contention was this problem of full nodes and how many of them there are and how few there are and how they're needed to essentially, get that database rippling around the network. In the presence of this 80 byte limit, we'd be able to ultimately have our data pruned, so people who are running full nodes wouldn't necessarily have to worry about hosting that data.
So just so people know, when you say prunable, you mean that the full nodes in the future will have a choice as to whether or not to store that data.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Well, lastly, how can we get in touch with you guys? Like, how can people get started with Mastercoin?
With Mastercoin, well, if you're a developer, go on GitHub /Mastercoin or MSC protocol on Twitter, and or you can dev@mastercoin.org. Just email us, and we'll have someone talk to you, whatever you're interested in. I think right now we're doing like $100,000 US in bounties every month. Some of that is given to the people who are working on it full time, and then for also people that are contributing something cool or building a faucet or helping with SEO or finding bugs, things of that sort. So you can get involved as much as you want, or just help out part-time, or whatever.
What exchanges does MSC trade on?
So right now, masterexchange.com, and then the distributed exchange, which you could use test.omniwallet.org for. And then we're building a daemon, which is integrated with Bitcoin Core. That will be out in the next few weeks. So hopefully that will make it a lot easier for exchanges to integrate our software.
Yeah, great. And Nikki, where can we get Counterparty Coin? XCP.
Counterparty is an open source, community-driven project. We need people to help out. Join us in the forums. If you want to get your hands on some XCP, you can get some from Poloniex. Also, I never quite pronounced this right, BT? The Chinese exchange. And you can also put some Bitcoin into Counter Wallet, as you saw. And you can buy XCP through the exchange like that as well.
Awesome.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for presenting. Give a round of applause, please. Thank you. We've got one more presentation, is that right?